Well, thank you, and I want to thank Tal and Shmuel and Gabby for inviting me to this workshop. This has been a great fun. So we're going to change gears now. We're going to go from the dry places in the dry places to the wet places in the dry places, okay? Because they're unique ecosystems. And what I'm talking about are springs, wetlands, salt lakes, the places that have the water in the desert situations and have persistent water. They're unique environments in that they're generally highly disconnected environments. So you have long distances between wet spots in the desert. They are not particularly resilient to human and climate changes, in some cases anyway. And they've also, perhaps more importantly, and something that I haven't heard too much at this workshop, is they've been impacted by humans wherever humans have existed in arid regions, since they've essentially co-evolved with humans. The only place that's an exception would be some brine springs that are in the Antarctic. So the impacts of humans on wet places in the desert is actually a fairly important concept. Before I get started, I just want to, just as John said, I may say we quite a bit, and that means grad student Mark Hausner. He did most of this work, and my co-authors from the USGS and the National Park Service. Okay, so as an outline, I'll introduce you to these things called pupfish. Okay, who are they? Why they are important? And then an introduction to this place called Devil's Hole in the western United States, and two what I think are fairly important eco-hydrological questions that are, again, not on the dry side, but on the wet side. How did these species get there to this environment? And then how are they going to be impacted by climate change, particularly human influences on climate change? These are both an evolutionary question as well as a societal question. So the question is, can we reconcile the evolutionary and ecological history of these fish with their really disconnected hydrologic environment? And I'll show you some pictures in a minute of how disconnected they really are. And then can we predict the impacts of warming on these fish to the life cycle? Are they going to survive climate change? Both of these are incredibly local questions in that we're working in a specific area. And when I say local, this is the most local place I've ever worked. It's about the size of this spot down here in front of us. But the simplicity of the system makes modeling fairly straightforward, and we can do some testing that's fairly practical. And I think it has some relevance to a lot broader questions, a lot of other questions. So where are we? We're going to be going down here to the American Southwest, basically down toward Death Valley, which is the lowest place in North America, the driest place in North America as well. This is just what the site kind of looks like. These are the fish. These are pupfish. They're about that big. Okay, so they're little guys. Now, I'm going to do something that I never should do at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the last day of a workshop. I want all of you to lean back in your chairs. Okay, and put your heads back. Like this. Okay? Everybody doing this? I don't see you. Come on. Okay. All right. Now, what you're seeing up there is if you were standing on the land surface at Devil's Hole, you would be looking down about 15 meters to a wet spot, a hole. Okay? And that's what you're seeing right here. You'd be looking down into this pool of water that's about 9 meters long, about 3 meters wide, and has some quite variable depths that we'll show you in just a minute. Okay, you're on the surface. The water level is down there. Okay, so a long way. There's no surface connection. Basically, this is a cave whose lid broke off. Okay, and the lid broke off about 60,000 years ago. And this has been a site. This Devil's Hole has been a site of incredible paleoclimate records. So a lot of the times, I'll throw out some dates here, and generally speaking, you can trust those dates. Okay, they've been well documented with uranium, thorium dates, and in some cases, radiocarbon. So this site opened up to sunlight and went from a cave to a lake, but with no surface outlet in the past 116,000 years at least. And this is what it looks like from the surface. We're down at the bottom of this. We're down there, I guess, or up there, wherever that happens to be. You can see these bathtub rings. This is the paleo level of this spring. It's not a spring, really. It doesn't discharge, but the water table, essentially. This is a window into the water table. And this is about 2 meters here. That's the level, the amount that this water table has fluctuated over the past 100,000 years. And it's been quite well documented. This site, by the way, is also has received a lot of hydrologic attention over the past 2 to 3 decades because it unfortunately is at the bottom end of a groundwater flow system that includes the U.S.'s nuclear weapons testing area, and it also included the proposed nuclear waste repository in the United States. So everybody kind of looked at this place and said, we better study this a little bit. And it has an endangered fish that lives in it. Okay, so and it has Indian tribes too. Okay, all right. So again, it's received a great deal of study. It is the sole ecosystem for the Devil's Hole pupfish. It's believed to be the smallest habitat for a vertebrate animal in the world. It's also home to 2 other endemic invertebrates, a riffle beetle and a spring snail. Those 2 guys live in other springs in the general area, but the pupfish, the Devil's Hole pupfish, only lives there. The water is warm, 33.5 degrees centigrade, because it's at the end of a fairly long groundwater flow system, and so it picks up a fair amount of geothermal heat. So we will get there. It depends. Okay. So these are the fish right here. Again, they're near the thresholds of survivability. They're living in such warm water. We have incredibly low dissolved oxygen levels, okay, for fish. The other challenge for these fish is that their primary productivity is highly variable through the season. And I'll go through that in just a second. It's believed from genetic analysis that they split off from their cousins, which are other pupfish, on the order of 10,000 years ago. Okay? Now, pupfish, what are they? They're a common species of fish. They live in the ocean. They also live in many river systems. And it's believed that they migrated up the Paleo-Colorado River up into the American Southwest. At some time when that was connected, those connections are now broken. And so we've evolved a whole series of these little fish in a variety of spring complexes and streams in the American Southwest. Okay? So there are different species. And many of them do live in different places. The Devil's Hole pupfish only lives in one. Okay? So the ecological question number 1, how did these fish populate this place if it's disconnected? And it has been disconnected over the lifetime that it's been open to the environment and been able to fix carbon that way. Again, they are related to other pupfish in the area, so that's where they came from. But if you take one of those other pupfish from the other springs, drop it into Devil's Hole today, it lasts about 20 minutes and then goes fins up. Okay? It's too hot. Okay? So you just can't do that. The riffle beetle, they don't fly. So how did they get there? There's several transport phenomena that have been proposed, and this has been an ongoing debate for probably 30 or 40 years. Avian, human, or perhaps a subsurface connection. So thanks to Sally, fish don't fly either. Okay? So how did they get there? The avian one, you can move fish around on the birds of feet quite easily, but that would probably occur multiple times. These fish, the birds move around, so it appears that these fish have been isolated for quite some time. So the egg hypothesis is not great. The eggs will survive, by the way, in the warm water. It's just the adult fish won't. Same with humans. There were humans there 10,000 years ago. They would have had to move eggs there routinely. Subsurface, there's been arguments that we know that this Devil's Hole is connected to the other springs in the area. So there is a subsurface connection. We think that there may be some large enough pathways, perhaps, or at least this is what one proposition is, that the fish swam upstream through the cave systems. Closest surface water is about 1 kilometer away. So I just want to throw out some additional evidence that this could be the case, and maybe a few other ideas. We were working, this is now a cross-section of the Devil's Hole. So it's a fracture in the rock if you look this way, and it happens to have a fairly big room here that direction. It's very hard to get the geometry of this in your head. So if you ever get confused, just look up, and you're still seeing it up there. Okay? Or you can fall asleep, whichever you prefer. Okay, so we were out there. We're interested in looking at the mixing that goes on in the environment because of developing a nutrient model and a food web model for how the nutrients move up and down in this environment. To answer Ronnie's question, the depth of this, it has been dove with scuba divers as deep as 150 meters, and it's still open. Okay, so it's quite deep. So we went out with fiber optic cables, as John described. We dropped a fiber optic cable into this down about 100 meters, and monitored water temperature through this environment over a season to see what was the mixing patterns that went on, again, to populate a food model. So the divers have reported, we do put divers in this place to count fish. They've said that there's submarine currents. The water chemistry is identical to springs downstream, so we know there's a hydraulic connection. And our monitoring does show both an overturn in the water temperature profile. So this is the temperature profile down to about 30 meters in January, and you can see it's actually quite well mixed. By summertime, we do see stratification. Happens to be inverse stratification from what you'd usually see in a lake, cooler on top, warmer on the bottom. But this does set up because, again, we're moving heat upward. And so you can see that we see a slight temperature decrease as we go up. And there's some bumps and wiggles in this. Also note the scale here. This is only over a couple of tenths of degrees in temperature. And these are DTS measurements of temperature every meter. So I'm just going to throw out here two profiles. Let's just look at these two. These are profiles taken in September and July, so in the beginning of summer and the end of summer. And we do see some structure in here in the temperature profile that stays there all year long. So there is something going on here where instead of the temperature profile being uniform, we see some structure to it. And it's possible if you arm wave enough, you can see that these things stay stationary. These could be places, and in fact, the divers who've worked in the area have said that they have seen sediment moving horizontally in these areas. So it's possible that there is some groundwater through flow coming in these areas. So the idea that the system is connected to its downstream genetic pool of fish certainly can't be thrown out. I personally have a little bit of trouble thinking that the fish would swim a kilometer underground in the dark, but the fish biologists tend to think so. Let me throw out another alternative hypothesis of how the fish got there, which includes this human element into our arid regions. The pupfish genetics says they came in around 10,000 years ago. That's coincident with the last glacial maximum in the area. The last glacial maximum would have had the highest groundwater flux because it was wet. The higher groundwater flows would have produced slightly lower temperatures in the spring discharge because you're still transporting the same amount of heat, but you've got more dilution. So the temperature of the springs may have been a bit lower. And at that time, you actually could then, if you took a pupfish from adjacent and dropped it into the pool, it could survive. And remember, in desert systems, there aren't many protein sources. So it's possible that this is a case where this was one of the early New World aquaculture programs, moving fish around the landscape. It's as good as anybody else thinks. Okay. All right. So second question, which is more perhaps ecologically important and societally important, is how vulnerable is this ecosystem to climate change? The American Southwest is obviously a fairly major place for climate change. The water temperature of Devil's Hole strongly affects the fish, and they are already on the edge of survivability. So here's kind of a plot of showing where they can reproduce. They can only reproduce 30 to 32 degree water. They can lay eggs up to 36. So if things get warmer, these fish are not going to make it. The food web in the area is strongly seasonal. In the wintertime, there's no sunlight that gets into this cave, and so they live on wind-blown carbon. They live on allochthonous carbon that comes in, and then in the summertime, they get algae production. But unfortunately, during the summer, when the algae is being produced, that also warms up the spawning ground so that their dissolved oxygen levels are too low. So they have this narrow window when they can breed once a year, and it relies on the fact that we get carbon coming in from the outside. So, and here's just a picture of that carbon being produced, that algae growing. Devil's Hole is an interesting swimming pool. It goes from a depth of about 20 centimeters on one end to a depth of 150 meters at the other end, without any signs that say, approaching the deep end of the pool. And this is where the fish spawn. They rely on this area for spawning. They have no other place to lay their eggs and to spawn. So here's a photograph again looking down. You can see over a fairly short period of time, this is the sunlight progression across. This is what drives the carbon cycle, as well as heats the substrate. So we went out and we were interested in measuring and developing a model, a hydraulic model and a thermal model of this spawning shelf. So we went out and put in fiber optic cables to measure the temperature in the water column and on the benthos. This was thanks to John Selker's idea of, instead of having 1 meter resolution on our DTS fiber optics, we took the fiber optic and made little loops out of it, and we were now able to get temperature measurements every minute, every 25 centimeters across this benthos. Those data then, this is just a plot at one particular time in the afternoon of the temperature profile, a cross-section through that spawning shelf of temperatures, and you can see the effects of solar energy warming this side, so the sunlight's hitting here, and it's cool here. Okay. We used those data to populate a CFD simulation, an energy balance model of that shallow shelf that included exchange with the water, the deeper pool water, to see what would happen to the temperatures in the area. And this is just a quick plot of those simulations over time. You can see we do have slow convection across, this is slightly vertically exaggerated, slow convection across this shelf, and then as time progresses and it warms up, we get small cells forming, and then those degrade overnight. And this is just a plot then of the impacts of temperature, climate change, on the temperature in the shelf, the spawning shelf. And so our, where are we? Let's see. The black line is the current temperature distribution mean monthly, so we get up as high as 33.5 degrees centigrade. As we move into warmer and warmer climates, we just modeled the energy balance from scenario A1b, so quite a warming, 3 degrees C warming. And you can see that as time progresses through this next century, the temperatures do warm up considerably across the shelf. And these are the peak temperatures. So the peak temperatures get very high and above the breeding level for the fish. So what we've done is we've taken those data, and we generated a breeding window. This is when they can spawn at these temperatures, and this is the temperature then on the shelf as a function of time through the season, with blue being today and pink being 2100. And you can see that they break out of their spawning window earlier and earlier as climate warms. Okay, they're several weeks ahead. And again, this is important because of the source of their food does come in from blown-in carbon. And so if we just look and say, how much carbon is going to be coming in versus their spawning time, as climate warms, they get about 20% less food coming in or available for them for the spawning temperature, for the spawning time. So they'll have less food in the future, assuming that the rest of the terrestrial environment doesn't change too much. So, how am I doing? Good, okay. So there's some interesting questions. These fish have survived hot temperatures before. In the mid-Holocene, we had temperatures that are warmer than they are today. How did they survive? How did they get through that climate bottleneck, if you will? Well, it turns out that the water levels were actually much higher in this area, about a meter higher during this warmer period. So water depth over the shelf probably does matter. And this is really the problem for these fish. So this is a graph of time on the bottom axis and the water depth over their breeding shelf from about 1960 on. And what happened was these fish were pretty happily going along here, and then groundwater exploitation in the area started. People drilled wells, and the water levels plummeted several feet. Sorry about the units here, it's USGS data. And basically their spawning shelf was dried up. These fish were going to go extinct. There's no question about it. The fish went to the Supreme Court in the United States. They won. Okay. The pumping was turned off, and the water levels have recovered. But the water levels have never recovered to their pre-pumping levels. So we're already down 30 centimeters from pre-development conditions. So what happens, this is now a plot then of if we have a 10 centimeter water column on that shelf, what do the temperatures look like as we just have 10 centimeters and we get quite warm conditions. If that water level is up at 90 centimeters, now much higher, we really don't cool off, we don't warm up the shelf nearly as much, and the fish can survive. So that's how they got through previous warming peaks. How they get through this one is a good question. And this just shows what their current status is today. These fish are counted. They send divers in twice a year, and they go down and physically count the fish. And these are the fish counts, spring and fall. And if spring is the pre-breeding season. And you can see that in the early 70s, there were only 100 fish left. That's it. That's the whole genetic pool. and their population kind of stabilized after we stabilized the water level. They've been declining significantly, however, since the mid-90s for reasons that are still unclear. And their population has declined precipitously in the last 5 to 6 years. And there's only 35 fish left as of 3 weeks ago. Right? Speculations on the reason. Changes in the food web dynamics at the site. There certainly has been changes. Loss of spawning habitat on this shelf because of changes in water level as well as other reasons. And then potentially, finally, rising temperatures. And indeed, we have seen in this area, the regional records are showing about 1/10 of a degree C per decade increase in daily mean temperatures. And the daily minimum temperatures have been increasing as much as 0.3 degrees C per decade. And that's quite important with respect to sensible heat flux off of the Devil's Hole water itself. That's where a fair amount of the energy is lost as sensible heat flux. So they are having their challenges. So in summary, using observations and modeling, I think we've shed a little bit of light on how fish have evolved in Devil's Hole, how they got there. I would say that that's still a very open question. We have speculative evidence, but more importantly, we can model how their environment will change given climate change conditions. These fish are already living at the upper end of their thermal tolerance. Declining groundwater levels are a local human impact. This is a common impact in arid regions all around the world. Water level declines. The springs and the seeps and the wetlands are the first ones to feel that impact. And so that's a local impact, but then on top of that, you're adding a regional or a global scale climate warming that's impacting their environment as well. And so indeed, perhaps these fish, instead of being a canary in a coal mine, might actually be a fish in a fishbowl. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
The question is, shouldn't we be feeding them? And the answer is they are being fed. They've been fed for about the last 5 years. They have tried to transplant them and generate breeding populations in other areas, or even literally in fish bowls, and they can't get the fish to breed. So, yeah, it's a pretty unique species. Sally?
Scott, I think it's a really nice case study of how refugia are probably one of the places where we should be looking really for evidence of catastrophic shifts, to use the jargon we've been using. And where you are right now in Western Australia, there are some extremely good examples of this that relate not to small endemic fish, but to populations of some of the major tree species. We can probably find similar sorts of examples around the place. I know Western Australia is good because it's been through these big cycles of drying and wetting. But I wonder if, in terms of, I don't know if you want to speculate about the value of these sorts of places for research, or whether it's something we want to consider as part of a roundtable discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think they really are indicative of, they're quite sensitive. Challenges are, in some cases, and this is one of them, it's the home to an endangered species. So actually physically working in the environment is challenging. But there are plenty of other places which are, for me, again, wet spots that are easily accessible, that can easily be monitored, and they tend to be small. So, and again, because they're isolated ecosystems, or can be isolated ecosystems, the connections are at least manageable, I think. So, yeah, I think society will be asking. So there's my soapbox. If somebody asks me, why are the fish dying, and I can't answer them, they're going to go somewhere else for the answer. And I don't think we can afford to have that happen. If we're seeing patterns on the landscape, and if we can't answer why that's happening in 3 sentences to our policymakers, then they're not going to listen to us. So,
there's a question.
No, just can you put, please, the dynamic population plot again?
That one?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So maybe we should stop feeding them?
No, the feeding. So I give. You want the long story or the short? I have enough time for the long story. So again, their temperature has probably gone up because the water level is not where it used to be. It's at its probably lowest stand in 60,000 years. So they're probably going to be a bit on the edge anyway. And let's just use the red one. The blue one is always, the fall count is always much higher and not necessarily indicative of the population as I understand it. So someplace in the early 90s, things started to fall off. There was an accidental kill of fish someplace in here, but the populations had already started to decline. And there is documented evidence that the algal community as well as the snail community that these fish do live on has changed in its species richness or species diversity. So there's some argument that perhaps their food supply has made a change. So the feeding actually occurred, I want to say, sort of at this time. And actually, you can see the bump in population here is probably related to feeding. Yeah. It's a tough problem. Nobody else? Yeah.
Anyone? Oh, no, okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Efrat to come and present her presentation.